In the last, I think, BRAC, they did a lot of joint base operations. I had the privilege of going down to Langley, Eustis down there. And the commander stated that there were like several bases that were going through this. Some in, I think, the state of Washington and up Alaska, and there was several others. Do you find that program being successful and go further to more joint base operations?
In those cases, I think that because they didn't close down Langley and they didn't close down Fort Eustis, and having that jointness works out well. We did the same thing at Fort Bragg with Pope Air Force Base and Fort Bragg. Nothing closed down, moved in. But kind of going back to the question and go with the whole efficiency thing, I agree with the gentleman there. Bigger bureaucracy, more government, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's more efficient. They closed down Fort McPherson in Atlanta, Georgia. Moved all those personnel to Fort Bragg, North Carolina. But guess what they had to do at Fort Bragg? Build more infrastructure, build more, another headquarters, build so much more. I don't know, in my opinion, couldn't see or don't even understand where the cost savings were. So you move more people somewhere, to a smaller house, guess what? You gotta build a bigger house, you gotta build more infrastructure, you gotta build more local services support, so on and so forth. So Fort Bragg loved it, Fayetteville loves it, but I don't know what we gained as a country as far as cost savings.
All right, we'll be able to take one more question, and Mrs. Lee is going to have some comments, I believe. No?
George, it's okay.
Oh,
Take
George,
more questions if you want to. I just would like a remark to thank everyone.
Okay. And then the officers will be happy to stay after to handle some additional questions as well. Yes, sir.
I just had a remark to follow up with George. Maybe you haven't heard that under this new BRAC thing, the only base to be completely shut down is right here in Pittsburgh, the 9/11. And of course, that's being fought by the congressmen around here, but I just want to follow up with George, what George said, that entire base is set to be closed down, as opposed to the depots you were talking about. So that's a big fight here in Pittsburgh right now.
In my hometown, we just had a base closed down, Fort Monroe, which I thought, growing up, would never ever be closed. But it's closed. Those personnel moved to Fort Eustis as well. The city are looking, matter of fact, part of the base, that they're looking at it as more of a national park, a monument. So there's some kind of use there. They're also going to look at some other mixed use type of programs, so on and so forth. But yeah, it's going to be another round because of the deficit and budgets and everything else. But it is local. Politicians, will determine which ones close and which ones stay open. Probably more important is at least for the military, when we hear this one's closing and this one isn't. Sometimes you scratch your head and say, well, that base in that state that we never used, that's already, going down the tubes. It doesn't have the training areas, doesn't have the ranges that we can even use, probably needs to be closed down. But when we find out there's one that's probably has more utility that's being closed. So that's probably the only part of it. But once the decision's made, it's made, and then we drive on. But it makes you scratch your head sometimes, like, man, who's making that decision? How do you come to that conclusion? But it's all politics.
Yes, sir. One more.